Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I see everyone's getting their audio connected. Wonderful. Hey there.
Hi.
Hey. Good. Glad we have so many new people with us here today. I'm really excited because that means there's a lot of people out there who are thinking of starting an intentional community, which is awesome. My name is Cynthia, and I'm going to be one of the hosts for today's session. I'm representing the Foundation for Intentional Community. I'm the communications director, and I'm calling from Vermont, where I live at an eco-village called Headwaters. And I'm currently in the process of building my house here, so it's an exciting time. They're pouring the concrete tomorrow for the foundation. Yeah. And I'm also joined by Carolyn, who is stepping in to be our new events coordinator and will also be helping with today's session, particularly helping to monitor the chat. Carolyn, you want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. I'm living right now at Dancing Rabbit Eco Village. It's in Northeast Missouri, and I've been in this area for the past 3 years, and I'm so excited to be here and joining y'all as the online events coordinator.
Wonderful. And of course, we're joined by Yana, who's going to be the teacher for today. And I'm going to introduce her in a little bit. But first, I have a presentation for you all to get things started. So I hope you can see this all right. Here we are for the session on how to start an intentional community. And we've done this, I think now like 3 times, and it continues to be one of our more popular workshops. And yeah, it's just exciting that we can offer this as an organization. Okay, so very quickly, some Zoom basics. If you're new to using Zoom or new to using Zoom with FIC, please remember to stay muted. Okay, we don't want any background noise coming through, so please stay muted. When you're ready to speak, you can unmute and also start your video so we can see you. And then 2 other good buttons to press are the participants button and the chat button, so you can see who's in the room and you can use the chat functionality. And the chat is great. You can send a message to everyone, or if you have a technical problem at all during this session, you can send a private message to me or Carolyn and we'll help you out. And please use the chat. The chat is like your own way to communicate while the session is going on. So I encourage you to introduce yourselves, say where you're calling from, what brings you to this session, where you're thinking of starting a community. That'd be awesome. And also to know about the raise your hand function. So if you click on participants, you'll see this button here to raise your hand, and we will have some opportunities for you to speak into the whole group. And because we have a lot of people, if you raise your hand on your video, we wouldn't be able to see you. So please use the raise your hand button so we can see on you and call on you to speak. And upcoming events. We actually have a workshop tomorrow, which is a really good complement to today's session if you don't know about it already. This is a workshop on how to start a new affordable co-housing project, and it's with Charles Durrett, who is an architect and co-housing community designer. He's created more than 50 co-housing communities across the US and the world. So if you're looking into or curious about the co-housing model in particular, I really encourage you to join that session tomorrow. And then on September 3rd, I'm giving a workshop on how to find an intentional community. So if you're not so much a starter, you're more of a seeker, this is a good session for you. We'll be going over the basic types of communities and some search criteria, research tools to support you in finding one that might be a good fit. And if you want to see them all, ic.org/recordings to download. And I'm excited to offer you all, as participants of today's session, a discount code, 15% off, for a book that Yana has written called Together Resilient. Building Community in the Age of Climate Disruption. So just so you know, Yana used to go by Maikwe. That's why you see Maikwe in the title, but it's the same person who has written the book. And the discount code is GROW-TOGETHER, and you can get the book at ic.org/together-resilience. So it's a lovely book exploring what's happening in the world with climate disruption, and specifically looking into intentional communities as a response to this. Okay. Yeah, I also want to share, so since I think most of you are starting a community, we have a few resources on the website specifically for you. I want to make sure everyone knows about our community classifieds page. We have all these different categories, and we're actually next week we're updating this page to make it even better. But this is where you can post that you're forming a community to help find other founders who may want to join you. You can see what communities out there have openings. You can get access to consultants and educators. So really encourage you to check out that classifieds page, just classifieds on the ic.org website. And also, if you are at a stage in your community that you are, somewhat developed, you have a group, you maybe have a piece of land, please go ahead and put a listing up on our website. Let the world know that you exist, and help more people find you. So you can create a listing also on our directory. And I'm really pleased to announce that the Foundation for Intentional Community has created a BIPOC Intentional Communities Fund that we are putting 10% of all of our donations towards. So specifically to help Black, Indigenous, people of color in joining, forming, and developing intentional communities. And you can learn more about this at ic.org/BIPOC-fund. And of course, make a donation at ic.org/donate. But really want to let everyone here know, if you know of someone who is in a marginalized group that is in need of support, to reach out and learn about the fund, or if you want to make a contribution to the fund, please consider doing that. All right, that's about all I have. So taking a moment here before we dive in together for the next 2 hours, just to push aside any distractions, have something to drink nearby, note-taking material, just to, arrive, center yourself, let go of whatever else was happening early in your day, just giving your full attention to Yana. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and share a little bit about who Yana is. Pretty incredible woman. She is a FIC board member, so Yana has many years history working with and being a board member of FIC. She also has 24 years of cooperative living experience, including 4 community startups. She's a trainer and a consultant for progressive projects. Her latest book, Together Resilient, Building Community in the Age of Climate Disruption, was awarded the Communal Studies Association 2017 Book of the Year Award. She is the former executive director of both the Center for Sustainable and Cooperative Culture at Dancing Rabbit Ecovillage and Commonomics USA, an economics justice organization. Her 2013 TEDx talk, Sustainable is Possible, kicked off a new era for her as a public speaker and advocate for communities. She is a founding member of the Solidarity Collective, an income-sharing community in Laramie, Wyoming, and a host on the community's podcast, Solidarity House. So I'll put that link to the podcasts into the chat, and also Yana's website, yanaludwig.net. All right, so just want to give a warm appreciation to you, Yana. It's always wonderful to have you back giving these sessions. I still can't think of anyone else I know who is more qualified and capable of leading a workshop on how to start intentional community and all the different things to think about. So delighted to have you, and thank you to everyone who is joining in, especially the first timers. Welcome.
Great, thank you so much, Cynthia. I appreciate being back again. And Yeah, so we're just going to kind of dive in, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And pop that in present mode. There we go. Okay, cool. All right, so you've actually already seen that slide because Cynthia popped it up a minute ago. So here's the stuff that I want to go through today with you. And this is very much a tip of the iceberg kind of workshop. I mean, spending 2 quick hours talking about starting a community. What I'm able to do in this workshop is sort of point you in certain directions and make sure that there's some core kind of reality check material that I think is really important for folks to get early on in the process. And so I usually start out with why you shouldn't do this, and then talk about why maybe you should do this. And then we'll break down some key elements that you need to be thinking about in order to have the project be successful. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about some spectrums that communities fall on and visioning. And then the relationship between 3 really big important pieces of your community, which is decision-making, membership, and vision. Talk very briefly about cooperative culture, which is one of my favorite soapboxes to get up on regularly. And a little bit about membership basics, and then a little bit at the very end about some very big picture stuff. And hopefully we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. And we'll do a little bit of breakout groups and some exercise stuff today. So hopefully you will not get tired of just watching me be a talking head for 2 hours. That is definitely not going to be a helpful way to do this. So happy to have all of you here, and let's go ahead and dive in. So the first thing, I've been told by some folks that I've been doing this workshop for like 12 or 13 years now, some version of it. And the first thing I do is try really hard to talk you out of starting a community. And these are some of the reasons why. So number one is that it's a really long and hard and not a very simple journey. And so starting a community is a little bit like getting married, starting a nonprofit, starting a small business, and doing a really intense personal growth course simultaneously with the same small group of people. And we can probably all think of a few people that we'd be up for doing some of those things with, but to actually be doing all of that stuff with the same group of people is a really intense process. And it also will take you longer than you would like it to take. The shortest timeline that I've seen groups get off the ground successfully is about 2 years. Typical is more like 7 to 10 years. So it's a very long-term process before you are able to actually get into doing the thing that you're picturing in your head right now that you want to do. So the second one is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Have you considered getting a dog and starting a nonprofit or a social benefit business? So the dog part is a little facetious, but I think a lot of people are interested in community for the companionship factor, and dogs are actually much better at that than humans are in a lot of ways. So that's why I've started using that framing. But there's also a lot of things where we're very mission driven. A lot of us who are founders have something that we can picture, sort of a better version of the world, whatever that means for us. And there's a lot of those goals that could get met by starting a nonprofit or a social benefit business. And to really think about, like, do you need to be doing a residential project in order to do the thing that you want to do? The next one is, does something close to what you want already exist, and why not join it? So, you know, most communities that I know are looking for new members, could really use new energy. And if there's something that's close to what you think you want, I strongly recommend people look at whether it would be close enough to join something rather than starting something new. And part of why I recommend that is that I can 100% guarantee you that you will not get the finished product that you are picturing in your head right now. There are going to be compromises, there are going to be reality factors that come into play, there's going to be other people's visions that you're going to want to integrate with. And it is highly unlikely that you are going to get exactly what it is that you want. And given that first one, that it is such an intense process, I really recommend folks look at whether there's something that's close enough that you feel like you could be a happy, healthy community member at one of those other places. The next one is about what motivates you. And you know, a lot of times those of us who have really strong founder urges also have pretty big egos. And it is really difficult to actually have a successful community if it's primarily ego driven. And part of that is because as a founder, you are going to at some point or another be the target of people's frustrations and potentially even hostilities, although often it's just frustrations that things are not going like you want it to go. And when you are a founder, you're doing a little bit of painting a target on your chest for folks to aim their frustrations at you. And if your primary motivation for being a founder is something that is ego driven, that's going to be really, really hard on you. It's got to, in some way, be about something that is bigger than yourself and that you're willing to commit to something from a place more of selfless service than from a place of ego. The next one is, have you toured other communities? Have you talked to other founders? Have you read Communities Magazine? This is important because people sometimes don't really know what they're getting into. And, you know, we think we can sort of picture what a community is going to be like. And it really helps to spend time in other communities to get a real feel for it. I can't tell you how many people have come to me and said, I want to start a community. And my first question is, have you visited other communities? And they're like, well, no, because my vision is really unique. And it's like, no. You got to go out there and actually get some reality on what it is you're doing. The other reason to do this, and I'll toss in part of my personal story here, is that sometimes what we think we want is not actually something that would work for us in real time and space. And so my first community that I lived in was one that had a mixture of kind of dorm style housing and cabins in the woods kind of housing. And I had pictured myself as a cabin in the woods girl ever since I was about 6 years old. And when I got into this community, after about 6 months, we got an opportunity to live in one of the cabins in the woods. And it took me about 6 weeks to figure out that I hated it. And I really wanted to be in the kind of hustle and bustle in the busier kind of dorm areas. And I was bored out of my skull living in a cabin in the woods. And had I created a community at that point in my life without having gotten some real data points on myself, I would have spent years creating something that I ultimately would have hated. And I think it's really important to actually get as much reality on yourself as you can before you invest too much in a particular vision. So the last thing on here is, have you gathered other co-founders together who balance out your weak points? So we're going to do a brainstorm in a couple of minutes about what some of the traits are of successful founders. And again, I can pretty much guarantee you that you are not all of those things and that you don't have all of those traits and all of those skills. So you've got to do this collectively from the beginning. I know a whole bunch of people who have, some of them have spent decades trying to get a very specific individually generated vision off the ground. And it's too much ego and not enough cooperation to actually have it work. And so I really encourage you to do this thing and get together with other potential co-founders and look for folks who really balance out your weak points. So if that hasn't discouraged you, then we can move on to some of the reasons why you might want to do this. But I'm just going to emphasize this one more time. Really, really think deeply and feel into it deeply about the decision to start a community. And, you know, right now the world needs a lot of community. And so I'm pushing people to try to be as realistic about this process as possible, but also please, some of you do this because the world really does need more projects like this. And here are some of the good reasons, and they can actually yield really good results and lead to successful community. So number one is, some of us are just weird and we really kind of crave hard, long, not simple journeys. And if you know yourself to be one of those people, this is a terrific match for your personality. The second one is that residential element really is key to your vision. Like, starting a nonprofit isn't going to cut it. You really need to be living with other people to do what you want to do. It also might be that there really isn't something very close to your vision already, and you genuinely believe that the world needs this thing. The world is going to be a better place because you're going to put in this work to do this thing. We also really need post-carbon and social justice learning spaces pretty desperately right now. There's very few places that have figured out what a post-carbon reality could look like, or even a very low carbon reality. The place that Carolyn lives right now, and where I used to live at Dancing Rabbit, is one of those places that's done a lot of work on that. And we've learned a tremendous amount in these spaces about how to actually live in the world that's coming. And we need more spaces like that. You have a really strong founder's urge that you feel like will help carry you through that kind of challenge that you're going to bump into. And, you know, somewhat in contrast to that, you're actually pretty good at collaboration and sharing power with other people. And you've done the work to learn how to kind of check your ego already. And those two things, strong founder's urge and ability to check your ego, don't naturally come paired very well together. And so you really need to have reached a level of personal maturity to be able to pull this off. And then finally, the reason why I'm in a community in Laramie, Wyoming, is that I fell in love with the guy. The kids had never lived anywhere else. If I wanted to live in community, I was going to have to start something, because I was going to be tied to this location for at least 10 years. And I really wanted to be back in community again. And so sometimes you find yourself where there's really nothing to join where it works for the rest of your life. And so you got to stay in a place. And so this is a reasonable reason to get another community off the ground. Okay, so that's a bunch of high level overview stuff. And I'm gonna pull, whoops, actually I wanted to keep sharing and stop doing that. Darn it, I just did that thing, Cynthia, that creates that weird glitch. Okay, now, sorry, I have this thing that my computer is doing that I don't quite understand why it does it. And sometimes I end up in this weird loop. Okay, so you can still see the slideshow at this point, this one page. Yeah, I did this right? Okay, great. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and do a quick brainstorm. That whole list that I gave you, those two lists, kind of foreshadowed a little bit of this. And so I wanna get from folks in a brainstorm what you think traits are of successful founders. Let's go ahead and generate this list together. And Carolyn, you wanna read stuff off to me?
Sure.
Go ahead and drop it into the chat. I'll just go ahead and put management on here because I've already been talking about it. Go ahead.
Empathetic.
Empathy. Good.
Persistence. Passion for vision. Professional mediator. Transparency. Flexibility. Introspective. Community pollinator.
Nice. I like that phrase.
You do. Resilient.
Uh-huh.
Nonviolent communication. Perseverance.
Okay. Put that up here with persistence.
Yeah. We've got determination too. I kind of feel like that one goes with that. And we've got good communicator.
Mm-hmm.
Someone said that their dad they're always thinking about what their people need.
Mm-hmm.
Compassionate.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's under empathy. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Well organized. We've got deep listener. Non-hierarchical facilitation skills.
Okay, this is great. This is a terrific list so far of social and sort of internal stuff. What about some of the like economic and physical plane stuff? It's missing so far from this list.
Well, there's one that's like, it says willing to take on legal tasks.
Uh-huh, yep.
Having money.
Mm-hmm. I'd say money or money connections. We'll talk about that.
Sure. Mhm.
Okay.
Financial management and financial knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Good. Cool.
Access to land. Critical analysis of capitalism.
Definitely for my kind of community, that's true. There are some kinds of community where you don't quite have to have that, but we're gonna leave it up there though.
Someone wrote physically able to work hard. Ooh, tech savvy. That's a good one.
Okay. Okay.
Got to get out there on the internet.
Yep.
Knowledgeable about process.
Mm-hmm.
Good manager. And with that one, there's one that said able to delegate. It's like a similar.
Great. Cool. I don't know why I suddenly can't spell the word delegation, but there we go. Okay. All right. Cool. This is a pretty good list. We could probably add more stuff to it, but for the sake of the conversation I want you all to have, this is pretty good. Is there anything really different that's popped up, Carolyn, before I close it out?
There's someone that said free from ideology or religion.
Okay, we'll say free from ideology. And again, some communities are very ideologically driven, and so that wouldn't necessarily be the case, but I'd say discernment about when your ideology is useful and when it isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Okay, great. So this is a good list, thank you. And if anybody is looking at this and going, oh yeah, I'm all of those things, I'm going to gently encourage you to check your ego a little bit because that's probably not really the case. But I do want to have you take this list. And I'm going to go ahead and think, is this opened up right now, Cynthia, already? Do you know? I don't think it is.
No.
Yes, anyone with the link can view. Okay, that's good. That's where I want it right now. So I'm going to go ahead and give you this link so you can get back into this document. And the list we just brainstormed is on slide number 6. And then there's a couple questions here that I'm going to have you get into small groups and introduce yourselves. And then, okay. And then just a quick conversation. What is motivating you to start a community, and what founder traits do you have? And which ones do you think you need to seek out people to partner with? And so you can reference this list in this document that we just created. And we're going to give you about 10 minutes to do this in small groups, and you'll be in groups of about 3. So Cynthia, you want to go ahead and cue that up?
Yes. Just a moment. Okay. All right, beautiful. So I'm gonna put you into groups of about 3 people, like Yana said, and you'll be in the breakout groups for 10 minutes. So when I open the rooms, you'll automatically be put into your breakout groups, and you'll see a countdown timer so you know how much time is left. And then when the time is up, you'll automatically come back here. You don't need to worry about doing anything or getting lost out there in Zoom land. So yeah, please have a good time in your groups and self-facilitate, practice that community skill. And I'll also put these questions in the broadcast so you can get reminded about what it is you need to talk about. All right, enjoy your breakout groups.
Cynthia, it looks like Carolyn.
Hello, everyone. folks are coming back. I think it'll just take a minute for everyone to arrive. See some smiling faces. I hope that means you had a good time in your breakout groups. Yeah, good. Thumbs up. All right, more and more trickling in. We have about 50 people on this call. That's a lot of people who are wanting to start community.
It's great.
Yeah, and we're at 20 now, so I think the next wave will come back in just a few more moments. There we are. Okay, Yana, everyone is back from their breakout groups, so you can take it away.
Great. All right, I'm going to go back to screen sharing now, back to our slideshow. You will, by the way, get this slideshow afterwards. So if there's stuff on the slides that you're like madly trying to write down, don't worry about it. You're going to get the slides access, and you already have the link actually. And you'll also get some handouts from me that'll give you some more detail on some of this stuff. So this next section, we're going to talk about key elements to ground your vision. And so there's 7 of them, and just going to go through and give you a quick slide. And again, any one of these topics could be their own 2-hour workshop or even more than that. So this is going to be just very, very top level highlights is what I'm going to be able to give you today. So the first one is your group. If you're going to have a group living together, you need a group. So what I encourage folks to do is to gather together a core of people early. And the kind of sweet spot of the number of people for the early visioning process is between 3 and 8 adults. And 3 people is enough that you're going to have some diversity on those skills and those traits that we were talking about a few minutes ago. And you also have enough brains that they're going to be able to kind of chew on stuff. And you also, when you get above 3, you also avoid the thing of like having it be like a monogamous couple who is starting a community and it's just their kind of internal thinking. So you want to get bigger than that for sure. Bigger than 8 can be a little rough though to do the initial visioning work. So you want to, and I'll talk more about visioning in a bit, but you want to have your vision take into account enough different perspectives that it's going to feel welcoming to a wide range of people. And it also needs to be specific enough that people know what they're joining. And 8 people, if you get any bigger than that, it gets a little bit hard to make some of those really big decisions about what this community is and isn't. And it also, you have enough people in the mix also that it can help with some of that ego management stuff that I was talking about before that's really critically important. So as I say, I'll come back to visioning in a bit. So sweet spot group of 3 to 8 people. So the second one is your property. And so if you're going to have a residential group, you need a place for people to live, and you need to have some search criteria. So I really encourage folks to not buy property first and then figure out what you're going to do on it. Now, of course, some people are in a kind of tough place with that because you already own property or you have access to family property or something like that. And, you know, if that's the case, you want to be really clear that the vision that you're creating is actually a good match for that property. So here's 3 different properties here, and they're obviously really different in terms of what they offer. And you want to make sure that the property that you have is a good match for what you're wanting to do on it. I also really encourage you to have a solid business plan in place before you start the search. So I've been a part of, you know, as Cynthia said at the beginning, this is my 4th startup that I've been a part of. And in a couple cases, we found property that was really fabulous and really amazing. And we had done no thinking about how we were going to pay for it and how those expenses were going to be divided up, and if we even had a viable business plan. And it was really disappointing because we watched those properties disappear on us because we hadn't done our legwork ahead of time. I also really recommend that you have more than enough solid people commitments to make it real. And part of why I suggest this is that when a community picks a property, you almost always lose members. Okay? And it's one of the hard realities of starting a community is that, you know, you're in it and maybe you're working with 6 people and you find a property that like 5 or 4 of you are really excited about and the other 2 people are not so excited about, but for various reasons you need to jump and make a commitment to that property, and then you lose those folks. And sometimes it takes a little bit longer than that. You know, in our case, when we committed to buying the property that we're on now, we had a core group of 5 of us, and 2 of those people completely freaked out 3 days after the paperwork was signed, and it just got a little too real. And sometimes you lose people for that reason. You know, they just weren't really ready to be making that commitment, and suddenly we had 3 people who had a business plan based on 5 people and a lot of scrambling that had to happen. And so if we had had 7 people and a business plan that needed 5 people, we would have weathered that just fine. And instead we had a really, really rough first about 16 months on this property where we didn't really have what it took in terms of the finances to be able to do what we needed to do. And if we'd had more people, we would have been a lot better off. So the other thing is that I encourage you to have search criteria so that you have something objective to go back to. If you find a few properties that might work, instead of just arguing amongst yourselves about which one is your favorites, you'll be able to go back to that criteria and go like, okay, so is this big enough? Does this have the land features that we wanted? Is it within our budget? You'll actually have those criteria, and that will make your decision making about which property to purchase a lot easier. Okay, so that's a little bit about property. So vision. So we're gonna play with some visioning work here in a little bit, but the most critical things, there's actually 2 of them. One of them is that it needs to be articulated early enough that it becomes a kind of North Star for you. Just like property criteria helps you to make better decisions, having a clear North Star is gonna help all of your decisions go better. You know what you're in it for, and you can weigh different possibilities and figure out, okay, but what actually supports our vision most clearly. The other thing is that sometimes people think it's better to wait to do our vision until we know everybody who's going to be involved with it. And the problem with that is that it makes recruitment really hard because people don't know what they're joining. It's like, we're going to do a community. Like, what does that mean? Like, where are you doing a community? What's the purpose of the community? What kind of community? And so it can make it really difficult to get firm commitments from people. And it's also a setup for having arguments further down the road. Like, say you get into it, you weren't very specific about things, and you get into conflict because you weren't specific enough, and people were able to kind of project whatever they wanted to project on a very thin vision statement. And so you want to make it firm enough that people know what they're joining, and where you can sort out who would actually be a good member and who wouldn't based on what the vision is. The next one is money. And so one of the things that we put on the list was folks who have money or money connections. And this is one of the things we don't really want to think about. Like, a lot of us are interested in community because we're interested in creating a kind of different cultural reality. And often that includes our relationships with money. And you need to have enough resources that you can access to be able to get onto the property and get this thing grounded. And it's not very much fun, but you need to get good at spreadsheets, you need to get good at budgets, and you need to actually deal with what are going to be probably some very difficult conversations about money. And one of the unfortunate realities is that you either need people involved who have enough class privilege, they can get bank loans, they have savings, they're able to loan money to the group, that's all class privilege. Or you're going to need to actually do some cross-class cooperation. And so, you know, in the case of my group, like, everybody involved in my group are all working class and poor people. None of us really had that kind of class privilege. And so we needed to create a relationship with someone who had class privilege. And that was a personal relationship that one of our members had. And that relationship had to go through this period of time of like really getting real about what it means to have class privilege and not have class privilege. What was a justice-based way to set up a loan agreement? And those are really hard conversations in a lot of ways. And I really recommend having them as openly and cleanly as you can. But this is one of the realities, is you either need class privilege or you're going to have to do this cross-class negotiation work to get your community grounded. Okay, the next one is legal structure. So somebody put on our list about, you know, somebody who's willing to deal with the legal stuff. You all need to be willing to deal with it a little bit, but you do want some people who are actually either comfortable operating in that world or willing to get comfortable operating in that world. One of the reasons why you need to do this is that I really disrecommend having one person own the property. So it creates a dynamic where, because that person can, technically speaking, pull the rug out from under everybody else in the group at any point, it doesn't actually matter if you're a complete saint and you would never do that to people. The fact that it is possible and that is legally backed up by the way our legal system is structured is going to create uncomfortable dynamics within the group. If you are somebody who owns property right now, then my recommendation is figuring out, what do you need in order to be willing to sell that property to the group and to put it into a collective container rather than holding on to one person having personal ownership. So you also want to use this step when you're doing the legal structure determination to get very clear about core ownership. Like, is it just the property that's owned collectively? Is the housing owned collectively? Or is that owned individually? What are your membership agreements? All of that very nuts and bolts, not very fun stuff is stuff that you're going to have to deal with. And it's at this stage when you're figuring out your legal structure that you're going to want to do that. Now I have this up because the Sustainable Economies Law Center is kind of the #1 resource for the communities movement. If you aren't sure where to go, you don't know how to start thinking about legal structure stuff, I highly recommend working with the resources that the Sustainable Economies Law Center has in order to do that. And the website is on here. It's just theselc.org. Okay, next one, key elements to ground your vision is operating systems. So what does your internal economy look like? Are you setting it up so that there's like a fee system that people put in? Are you doing income sharing? You know, this is a model that about 13% of communities opt for. Do you have a shared labor system? And what does that look like? What are your communication systems, your member process? How are your meetings going to happen? And what are you using to decide? Are you a consensus-based group? Are you voting? How are you doing these kind of basic operating system stuff of your community? And then similarly, what are your agreements? And this is kind of one level down from operating agreements. So, you know, this is around like behavior, participation, cleaning, you know, those sort of very core things that are more of your everyday interactions with each other level of things. And you need to have some core agreements. And I'll give you the list of things that I think are absolutely essential before you move in with each other. But you want to be thinking both about that sort of core operating system and the agreements level, and put some structural stuff in place before you're actually living together. Okay, so that was a lot of information. These are the things I want you to most strongly take away from this though. Before you move in with each other, how are you making decisions? Getting onto property together, making a commitment to each other, and then figuring that out is a very bad idea. How are you gonna navigate decision making? What's your vision, the purpose that we're bringing together? Talked about that already. What's the process for both joining and leaving the community, including involuntary loss of membership? In other words, somebody is not working out for the rest of the group. Somebody is violating your agreements regularly. For some reason or another, someone is not a good fit, and the rest of the group feels like we're done trying to work with this person. Now, I want you to work on conflict resolution so that this isn't the first place that you go with stuff. But it is really important that you have some way of understanding how somebody not only gets in, but also how they get out and how they get booted out if need be. This is the thing, even more so than legal agreements and money, this is the thing that people most don't want to think about, because we all want to believe that it's all going to work out really great. And it sucks to actually have to figure this out when there's a real person and a real set of circumstances in front of you that you're like, ooh, I wish we had figured this out ahead of time, really figure it out ahead of time. And so this is going to be both how they get out in terms of the group process and how they get out in terms of like legal and financial stuff. So stickiest wicket in this whole thing is this piece right here. So the next one, what is your financial structure and how are you paying for things? So again, this is your business plan, but also those core questions about things like, are you going to be income sharing or are you going to have independent finances? So the next one is participation and conflict resolution expectations. Do you expect everybody to be doing work? I saw in one of the comments somebody saying that the physical work requirement is ableist, and it can definitely be ableist. And so you want to know, how do people participate? Is it only going to work for people who are able-bodied? Is it going to work for other people? What are the different ways that we see productive participation in the group? And then finally, another really sticky one is, what are your agreements about what happens if it doesn't work? And not just with one person, but if you can't figure out how to pay the bills, or if it falls apart in terms of your social relationships, what is the community dissolution agreements that you have in place? And these don't necessarily have to be, it doesn't necessarily have to be like every last detail about first this conversation happens, then this conversation happens, but you want to have a basic framework in place, and you want to have agreements about how you're going to make those more fine decisions about what happens in case that it doesn't work out. And if you do these things, both the involuntary loss of membership and what happens if it doesn't work out, for a lot of people, this is going to help them relax and commit more strongly to the group. If you don't have that stuff figured out, it's going to be hard for some people to make a real commitment. So even though it sounds like this is talking about like the worst case scenario stuff, it's also going to lay a clear foundation for a bunch of people to be able to really step in with you. Okay, so this is just a little side note. I created a workshop about a decade ago called this 7 Things Intentional Communities Always Fight About. What this really means is that you can expect tensions in these areas, and I really encourage you to make some core agreements about them early on. Not necessarily before you move in with each other early on, but pretty early. And don't freak out if you get into conflicts about pets or about food. This is really just basic human stuff. And one of the interesting things about all of these categories is that, and I know some of you are not in the US, but in the United States anyway, these are all things that in the US, this is like your personal business. Whether you have kids or not, how clean you keep your kitchen, what you eat, how noisy you are. You get into community though, and those boundaries are not in quite the same place. These are all things that impact each other much more intimately in community than they do if you just live on a block with other people. And so I used to joke that this is like the welcome to the human race card when your community gets into your first conflict about one of these, because this is really just like, okay, now stuff's getting real with each other. So please do not throw in the towel over any one of these issues. This is just stuff that you're going to have to deal with. Okay, so visioning a life together. So this next section, we're going to actually talk a little bit about what kinds of things you want to think about in terms of visioning and get to play with it a little bit. So here's 4 keys to good visioning. So number 1 is know thyself. So if you are clear about who you are and what your bottom lines are and where you are flexible, that's going to be really good for your group. We're going to play with this spectrums for groups thing in a minute here. So don't worry if you don't understand that reference, it is coming in just a minute. So again, do it early, but not solo. So you are not a group, you are an individual. And so you need to get into that space of sharing power and sharing ideas with other people early on. And you're gonna have a much more resilient, a much stronger, a much better vision if you've actually done that together. So balance, being specific enough again so that people know what they're joining, but also open enough that they can see themselves in it. So I know a couple groups that have never, it's actually mostly individuals who have never gotten something off the ground. And part of the problem is they have a 20-page vision statement where nobody else can breathe. I mean, they look at this thing and they go, ooh, well, I like these 6 pages, but this is like a little too specific. So a page is pretty good. And you can also look at being really clear about what your core values and your core tenets are. And again, I'm going to reference Dancing Rabbit Eco Village here. There's 7 ecological covenants at Dancing Rabbit that are really interesting and really solid and specific enough that you can look at it and go like, ooh, could I work with that group? And they point to a particular direction that the community is there for. But there's plenty of space for how you actually live into those core tenets. And so if you want to check out a group that I think did this really well, go to the Dancing Rabbit website and check out what they've got. And it may not be exactly the way that they've got it framed, but basically if you have a 1-page vision statement, that's a pretty good balance point. So then beware what I call the Warsaw blot phenomenon. So there are these words that every group puts into their vision statement and they mean nothing because people can literally project anything they want to on those words. So sustainability, does that mean you recycle? Does that mean you're trying to have like a negative carbon footprint? Both of those things are sustainable under some people's perceptions of them, and they are very, very, very different. So if people buy into your vision based on a bunch of these words, a couple years from now, you're going to get into some really nasty conflicts with each other because somebody's going to be like, no, we need to be doing this thing because we said we're about sustainability. And somebody else is like, that's not what I thought that word meant. So get clear about these kinds of words early on rather than letting them become sources of conflict not too far down the road. Okay, so we're going to play with these spectrums here in a few minutes, but I want to just walk through these things. So there's 2 pages of these. There's a bunch of them here. And these are things that every community either deliberately chooses a place on these spectrums or they default to. And it's okay to leave some things to default. You know, as a founder, again, I'm going to encourage you to be clear about like which one of these things are you really uptight about and you got to have it a certain way, and which one of these things are you really okay with it emerging more organically as the group gets more people involved. So I'm going to introduce these quickly and then we're going to do a little exercise with a few of them. So the first one is income sharing versus independent finances. And income sharing may mean that everybody has individual incomes that get pooled together into one bank account like a family. Or it could mean that you're a community that has shared businesses and everybody's income comes through those businesses and everyone in some way or another participates in those businesses. But it's like basically pooling your income together versus having some kind of a fee system where you get your money, you get your community budget through people putting in money, but they're independent finances in terms of how they're making their money. Related but not the same thing is high versus low resource sharing. And so there are communities that are independent finances but do a lot of resource sharing. So they have a common house, they share cars, they have shared garden spaces and that kind of stuff, shared tractors, you know, all kinds of different ways that you can do a lot of resource sharing even if you don't have shared finances. However, income sharing communities are kind of inherently high resource sharing because you're buying the stuff together, you're buying the property together, etc. There are also communities that don't even have a common house. They have property and everybody's got their own houses on that property. They do a potluck occasionally together, and it's really not very communal at all other than a kind of neighborly camaraderie. The next one is about the cost to join. So some groups, and it's usually income sharing groups, although there are some exceptions to this, there isn't a cost to actually get in the door. You can join and become a member without having to put money on the table. And then you have communities that have a very high cost to join. You put in $50,000 when you show up, and then you have to build your house independently on top of that. The advantage to having some cost to join, I mean, it might sound like, well, why would you have a cost to join? That sounds like a barrier. But it does give you actual money to work with as a community when you have some kind of a joining fee. So the next one is about your orientation to spirituality and religion. You have groups that are spiritually the same. So this is going to be your monasteries, your ashrams. You have groups that have a requirement that people have some kind of a spiritual practice, but it's not identical. And so that's going to be spiritually diverse. And then you have all these different categories here. And then you have some communities that are actually pretty intolerant of spirituality. They don't want religion. They don't want you bringing it up. They're not really supportive of people having any kind of a spiritual practice. They are beyond secular and actually in this kind of intolerant zone. Next one is pretty self-explanatory, rural versus urban. There's lots of space in between. I've lived in communities in counties that don't have stoplights, and I've lived in very urban environments. And so there's viable ways to do community in any of those environments. You just want to be clear what you want. So mission driven, so these are the groups that are in it to change the world in some way when you're all the way over on this end of the spectrum. And then there's groups that it's really not about some big picture thing. It's really about, we want to create a good neighborhood to raise our kids in, and where I know my neighbors and it's a friendly place to live. Inwardly focused versus outwardly focused. You've got groups that are really, it's a small group, it's 5 or 6 people, and they're really just focused on these 5 or 6 people. Sometimes spiritual groups are very inwardly focused. They don't do tours. It's really about spiritual practice for the members. And then you've got groups that are really outwardly focused, that have vibrant visitor programs. They have a column in the local paper as a standard thing. They're very much welcoming of folks coming in and being sort of having a permeable barrier with the outside world. Size is another one that's fairly self-explanatory. There's communities that are 3 or 4 people, and there's communities that are thousands of people. Obviously makes a big difference to your quality of life and to what your life feels like. So low tech use and high tech use, there are groups that don't own cars, they're doing horse and buggy, hand tools, don't have the internet, don't have telephones, all that kind of stuff, very much at the low tech end of the spectrum. And then you've got groups that rely really heavily on tech. It might be that your common house has all of the bells and whistles and everything's automatic, or you do most of your community process online, is another version of high tech use. Mainstream and radical appeal. You've got some groups that really try hard to look sort of middle class normal and not freak the neighbors out. And then you've got groups that are really doing something radical and they're owning that, and that's who they want to pull in, are the folks that are attracted to that. Decision making, it's obviously really different to have a sole leader who's like a charismatic person who's making a lot of the decisions for the group, versus a voting system, versus a consensus system. And then one step further out from that are these kind of deep alignment groups. It's usually spiritual groups where it's not just about consensus and can we live with it? Do we think this is the best that we can do? But it's really about, it needs to have real resonance or we're not going to do the thing. Most groups are shooting for some kind of like more flat power or dispersed power setup. Some groups are really lopsided though, whether that's officially because you've got this sole leader thing going on, or it's just that you default and you haven't really questioned power dynamics and you haven't questioned social justice values and that kind of stuff, and things are just really, really lopsided. So how the group relates to conflict is another big determiner of what it feels like. Some groups are like, what? I don't see any conflict. Like, we're gonna not get involved. People work their stuff out. That's very hands-off. And then you have groups who are really grounded in an ethic that we're here to resolve conflicts. We're here to do deep work together. We are gonna lean very strongly into when there's tension between each other, the group is gonna get involved, it's gonna support, or maybe insist that people deal with their conflicts with each other. Okay, last two, rules-based versus relational-based. So there are groups that have a very thick rule book and lots of policy. When tensions come up, when problems happen, they reach for, let's create a policy to figure this out. And then there's groups that are very relationally based. They don't write a lot down. They don't have a lot of formal agreements with each other beyond the basics. And the expectation is if tensions come up or if problems need to be solved, we're going to do that in the moment. And we're going to lean into being very relational with each other to do that. Most groups are not at either one of the extremes on this. And it is easier for small groups to lean more toward the relational end of the spectrum than it is big groups, just as a general statement of group dynamics. And so finally, the last one on here is moving toward energy versus resistant energy. There are groups that are definitely formed in reaction to what's happening in the wider culture, and have this kind of like resistance and rebellious kind of energy about them. Tends to be very dynamic and very edgy. And then you have groups that are more like, hey, we have this kind of cool thing we want to see if we can get together and do together. And it's moving toward energy in terms of, here's this like North Star that's really interesting to us and we're going to kind of experiment with it. But it's not necessarily that kind of edgier, resistant energy. Now, I will say on this last one that I had a very lovely group push back really strongly against this being on a spectrum. It was a group of nuns that I worked with in Denver for a while, and they were like, we are absolutely resisting what's happening in the culture and we are absolutely moving towards something and we refuse to do this spectrum. And I was like, awesome, you rock, you're super clear about who you are, and that's fine. So it's not necessarily so all of these, it's not like there's a right answer to them, and sometimes groups have a take on this that I think is really interesting, and the purpose of laying all of this out is to help you get clear about who you are, and if that means resisting one of these, that's totally fine, and you should use this tool as it is valuable for you. Okay, so we're gonna do a couple of these as interactive exercises here, and this is also a way that I can demonstrate how to do a little bit of online facilitation, which is fun. So I'm going to change temporarily the settings here so that you will, for a few minutes here, have editorial privileges on this document. Does everybody still have the link? Or can, Carolyn, can you repost that link for folks? I know some folks came in after it was here. So I've got 3 of these laid out in the next 3 slides. You may have to refresh if you were already on this document before to be able to get down to slides 23, 24, and 25. And what I'd like you to do is go ahead and go into the document and pick up a dot. And the motion that works best with this is to click on it and move it in one motion. So I live in an income sharing group, so I'm going to put a dot there. That is what I prefer. But you can all come in, grab a dot, and put it where you would prefer for your ideal intentional community. So you have economic model. And then the next one is location. And same thing. I'm going to put a dot where my group is. I live in a very small town. Not very small, not like Rutledge, Missouri small, but Wyoming small. And then the third one is population size. And so my group wants to be kind of in there, even though we're not there yet. So that's my ideal. Let's go ahead. We're just going to do a quick visual survey here of who is in the group today. I just love watching this exercise happen. It's part of why I keep doing it. And you may not have opinions about one of these, and that's fine. You don't have to put a dot, or if you're not sure, it can just be food for thought for today. Cool. So far, we don't have any big village people in this group. Oops. Somebody just grabbed the label instead of grabbing a dot. And move that back down here. I'm going to try to move that back down here. So I really encourage you doing a version of this exercise with your forming group. Or if you have a big public meeting, you know, say you're in like an urban area and you're gathering people together that might be interested in it, doing a version of this exercise. You can either do it online like the one that we're doing right now. You can also do it on, this is an example of one that I did on flip chart paper with folks where I gave people colored dots. So there were actually two forming groups that got together and had me come in and do a workshop with them. And so the green dots were one group and the yellow dots were another group. This exercise actually got a couple people to switch groups where they were like, wait, my dots were actually closer to the other color dots. And so there was an interesting thing that kind of played out by having a couple different groups do this. So definitely feel free to use this exercise. And again, you'll have all of those spectrums in the form of this slideshow. And you can also use one of these slides as a template if you want to make a copy of the slide and create your own online thing, you can do that. But this exercise is super helpful to get clear about where you have alignments and where you don't. And then you've got a choice to make at that point. Are, you know, the places where we're misaligned, are those places where we can actually live with not having a group take on that thing? Or do we really need to answer it? Like the urban rural one, you're going to have to answer that question, at least unless you have multiple properties. And some of these, it's like you may not have to answer the tech question, for instance, to be able to live together. But you can get into some very interesting conversations with each other about where do we need to actually have some conversation because we're not sure that we're really aligned enough to be able to do this. This is the kind of thing that groups typically don't do, and then you figure out a few years in that you actually had some misalignments that you really should have answered early on before people got really invested. Okay. I'm going to give you another minute to do that before I change the setting here and stop letting you edit. I like doing this exercise, but it always makes me a little nervous. Like anybody could be editing my document right now while I'm not looking. Okay. Another 30 seconds and I'm going to close it down. Okay. Changing this back to viewer. Okay, thank you, everybody. Definitely do some version of this. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and do like just a very short breakout. Again, you're gonna be in pretty small groups with this. We're gonna give you about 7 minutes to just have a quick debriefing conversation about this. And you can answer these questions if you want to or not. But you know, a few things that you're like, oh, I really need this. And a few things that you're like, I'm not so sure whether I need that or not. So Cynthia, if you want to go ahead and put them in, and like I say, like 7 minutes, we're going to do this pretty short.
All right, I'm just getting it set up. 7 minutes. Okay, so you'll go back into more or less the same breakout groups that you were in before. And just like before, we'll bring you back automatically when the time is up. And I'll pop these questions into the broadcast. All right, enjoy your breakout groups. Okay, looks like just have Dale, who's still here. Dale, let us know if you need help getting into the breakout group. I'm suspecting something's not working with your microphone. So, oh, well. Oh. Okay, people are slowly returning. Mm. Are everyone back? Okay, and it looks like everyone is back. I hope you had a good time in your breakout groups. Nice.
Okay, cool. So one more round of this screen sharing stuff. There we go. Okay, great. So I want to talk about some sort of bigger picture stuff. We've been not quite in the weeds, but at least in the sort of mid-level stuff for most of this. One of the most important relationships between elements is described here with this little triangle thing. So, we've been talking about vision, that it's really important to know, why you're coming together, and that that's going to be a guiding principle for you. And it's a guiding principle in part for your decision making. It's going to give you something at least a little more objective to come back to when you have hard decisions to make, and you can go like, okay, so what's actually
Yana?
And there's also your membership process though. So there are definitely groups that they don't want to be too picky, or they don't want to be judgmental about people, or something like that, where we get really nervous about saying no to people. And it's really important, depending on your vision, to be able to actually say yes and say no in a very deliberate and consensual way. And so basically, the more radical your vision is, the more you're going to want to make sure that the people coming in are actually really in alignment with that. And radical, by radical, I mean the more the more different it is from mainstream culture and mainstream values and mainstream goals. So the more you're de-emphasizing individualism, the more you're going to want to make sure that there's really people coming in who are on board with that. Similarly, if you're doing consensus decision making, you want to make sure that people have at least good enough listening skills that they're able to actually do consensus and listen to other people and be able to ground themselves in something other than just their individual wants and needs. And so you want to be thinking really deliberately about these three things in relationship to each other. And then I'll say a little bit more about the membership part of this. So, so here's some elements that are going to make your membership process functional. So having clear stages. So somebody's going to come in, they're going to be in this kind of get to know each other period of time. And then most groups have some kind of a provisional member period where it's you're participating in the community life. If you're a community where people have to buy houses, then obviously you're not going to be able to have people living on the property until they've become full members and can do that. But you want to be spending an increasing amount of time with people as you go through these different stages, and giving people more rights and more responsibilities as they move along. And then eventually you're going to move into full membership. Now, there are some groups that don't have any stages at all. You're either a member or you're not. And all you have to do is buy a house and then you're a member. And I really strongly encourage you to find ways to do at least some vetting of people before just jumping them from you've never met them to you're now one of my neighbors and we're in consensus process with each other. That's a very, very steep curve relationally for people to go through. And so we want to make sure that as much as possible, we're able to have these clear stages. Again, pairing rights with responsibilities, both of which get stronger as you go along. So, for instance, provisional members are often, it's totally fine to participate in decision making, but you don't have the right to block a decision if you're doing consensus until you're a full member. So that's an example of where there's like different stages that people go through to get to the point of becoming members. So having criteria for members is important, and I'll talk a little bit about that in very general terms on the next slide. Just re-emphasizing knowing how someone leaves the group or gets kicked out, and being very clear about the intersection between membership, legal rights, money, and equity at each stage. And they could be different answers at different stages. So for instance, with my group, we're moving toward income sharing. And so as people come in, like they're not doing full income sharing and they're not building equity in the project until they become full members. But we have different financial relationships with people when they're in the provisional member period than we do when they're in the full member period. Okay, so here's 4 elements of membership criteria that I encourage folks to have some version of. So values match. You want to make sure that people are actually on board with what the group is there to be doing. And this is often self-assessed. You're making sure that you're clear enough about your vision and about what the basic requirements are. And then you ask people, do you feel like you can do this? Do you feel like you're in line with this? And there's usually not a need for the group to be passing judgment on whether people are values aligned enough. The second one, though, is social skills. And this is a thing that I do encourage groups to be doing active evaluation of. And this is both the hardest part and in some ways the most important part. And I say that in part because the number one reason why groups fail is social dynamics. We don't know how to cooperate. We come out of very individualistic culture in the United States and Canada anyway. And so we often really suck at the social stuff. And it's helpful if the group is in a relationship with individual members where we're learning together. And so it's not like you just have to figure out all of this on your own, but we're providing training, we're providing skills building opportunities for people. But ultimately, you do want to actually do a little bit of passing judgment on people. Like, does it seem like this person is going to be somebody we can actually be in community process with, and who is going to be willing to work stuff out if things get difficult? So what do they do with conflict? What do they do with getting feedback? It's that kind of stuff that you're going to be looking at. Not, do they have the same communication style that I have? Like, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the ability to actually get in there and do the work of listening and working things out with people when push comes to shove. So the next one is contribution capacity. And this is going to vary widely with different groups. I mean, some groups really do need a lot of people who are able-bodied. Some groups, that doesn't matter at all. That's not really that important. And so you want to look at what are the labor needs that the group has and what kind of requirements do we need to ask people to be able to meet. Same thing with time, same thing with money. Now, there are not just ableism concerns here, there's also classism concerns here for folks, which also intersect with race and gender. So there's this whole big package of ways that you can go very, very wrong by not doing this stage carefully enough. But you also have got to be realistic about, like, what is it going to actually take for this group to get off the ground, to get established, and then to operate in an ongoing way. And then the last one is intuitive, and this is also one that can be very tricky. And some groups skip this one entirely. You just want to make a decision about it. But I've definitely seen groups get into trouble where half of people in the group were like, I don't think it's going to work with this person. I can't put my finger on it, but this does not feel like it's going to work. And there was nothing in their group membership process that allowed that to be part of the conversation. It's like, you either fit these 6 criteria, you check off these 6 boxes, or you don't, is how some groups do this. And I encourage you to be open to the idea that if people are deeply uncomfortable with someone, that it's okay to unpack that. And that unpacking might be, wow, we just discovered this big batch of racism that we have internally that we need to work on as a group. Or it could be, actually, this person has terrible boundaries and doesn't actually know how to interact well with people, or they're a raging sexist pig and we don't actually want them in our group. I mean, I think that there's sometimes things that are harder to enumerate and harder to check boxes off with, but are really important to be able to have on the table. So one of the criteria that I like that's a little more objective is this last statement, whoops, go back, about is there at least one person in the group who's excited about living with them? And sometimes you can cut to the chase with it, with that criteria. And my group uses that criteria, and we've, there's been people who have been like, they're fine, but we're a pretty intimate group. We're 6 adults right now. And so having somebody come in that like nobody is excited about is going to actually set that person up for failure in a group like ours. And so you want to be able to have some way of actually assessing this. So there's a note down at the bottom here, having collective ownership of the housing gives you a little more latitude with membership decisions than private ownership does from a legal standpoint. And so this is one of the things where you're in there making decisions about how you're going to set up your basic community structures. This is one of the things that you can think about. Okay, so very big picture summary, and then hopefully we will have, we'll have a few minutes left for questions, yay. So creating community is hard and complex work. Yeah, there's a whole lot to think about and a whole lot to take into account with this, and you can expect to work really hard at getting this thing off the ground. Sometimes people think like living in community is just going to be completely joyful and everything's going to be smooth, and that is absolutely not going to be the case. You're going to have moments that are going to be really difficult, and be prepared for that. So you're going to be constantly balancing some things. So there's compassion and inclusion. I think we go into community because we want to feel held, we want to feel seen by the people around us, we want to feel like people really care about us, and that's the compassion part. And inclusion is, and we want to have as many people be able to be here as possible. But then you got to balance that out with discernment and clear boundaries. And so again, this is going to be stuff like your legal agreements, your membership process, that it's okay to say no if somebody's really not a fit. I mean, that's a boundary question, and it's really hard, and it rubs up against inclusion, but you got to be balancing that stuff if you want this thing to be viable long term. Yes, you have to deal with the money and legal system stuff. I really wish that wasn't the case, and it's definitely part of what you need to deal with. Get used to making and applying criteria for decisions. So this is probably true for any organization out there, but I want to emphasize it here because in order to have us be really healthy groups, we need to be able to set criteria and then follow them as we're doing decision making. Social stuff is really hard. Get training, and ideally get training from people who are familiar with intentional community living. There's a lot of people out there who are really terrific facilitators in the business world and are really good trainers for communication for business applications, and they are in over their heads when it comes to intentional community because the relationships are much more complex. There's a lot more levels to the interaction. I have seen multiple folks who have terrific professional skills seriously flame out when it comes to trying to work with communities because they just don't get the deep interrelations that happen in a community setting. So don't forget why you're doing this, whatever that thing was that inspired you. Put a thing on your wall to remind you of it, because there are moments where you are probably going to find yourself forgetting and really needing that reminder. And also that you're part of a movement. And so, this little workshop is put on by the Foundation for Intentional Community. It's a national and to some degree international organization of communities all over the place. And we're all doing the same work of trying to figure out how to have a better life, how to have a more purpose-driven life. And there's a lot of wisdom in that movement. And so please see yourself as part of it and get and stay connected. Okay, one more quick thing in terms of big picture is that you're doing culture change work when you do community work. And so this is just a brief, incredibly brief snapshot of some of the cultural transitions that you're going to end up going through. So from being an independent operator to being much more interdependent with people, from judgment to discernment, from me to we, from hoarding resources. We live in a culture and an economic system that really encourages us to hoard. And you're going to move into a place where it's like much more about sharing. And that's going to rub up against some of your cultural training. From being really competitive with people to being cooperative, and from blame to compassion. And so, like I say, this is a really brief snapshot. I have a co-authored book coming out next month. I think we're still on track for that, called the Cooperative Culture Handbook, that goes into 120 pages of detail about what I'm talking about here. But it's important to be recognizing at the very least, even if you never think about it past this, that you're in lifelong work and that it really is a cultural transition, and you're going to bump up against a bunch of cultural training when you try to do anything cooperative, and community is kind of the deepest cooperative out there. So good to note. Okay. Oh, and then here we've got this slide again. So there's that discount code for Together Resilient if you're interested in the way that climate intersects with all of this. And that's my contact information. So we're going to open it up for questions for the rest of the time, but I will leave this up for a minute if you want to jot this down. So yanaludwig.net and mayana.ludwig@gmail.com. So you can stay in touch and be connected with me too.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Yana. It was really rich and wonderful as usual. And I did put a link to the Cooperative Culture Handbook pre-order page in the chat as well, so folks can check out that book coming up. Good. And yeah, and for the Q&A, please use the participants button and the raise your hand button to like not raise your hand on the screen, but to use the raise your hand button so we can see you and call on you. And then we can also take questions in the chat. I know there's already a bunch of questions in the chat. So as there's time, we can kind of go back and look at those. But I see there's two people with their hands up. So maybe we go to Bashu first.
Hello, thanks for that presentation, Yana. I wanted to know, either you can answer this on a global or just even just a personal experience level. How would you rate the importance of looking for support outside of your community? Say you're in a community with some people and you're like, oh geez, I feel like I really need an outside opinion. Are there cases where you'd recommend against it? And also, you know, support systems like families or even professionals, because I know there's intentional community consultants. Do you think that's a good idea?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that getting outside help is a sign of a mature community, actually. So I do really recommend it. And, you know, there's definitely value in sort of getting in there and sort of grappling with stuff on our own. But if you find yourself feeling like you're in over your heads, you probably are. And there's probably somebody out there who has been through this before. And I know that, you know, that FIC has been doing some sessions where communities get a chance to get together and talk to each other and share information. And so that's one of the perks of being an FIC member community, actually, is being able to participate in those. And I think it's a really valuable resource to be able to just share stories with each other. And yeah, I also think, you know, working with professionals is really helpful. And again, just make sure it's people who are going to get the context. Like, it doesn't necessarily matter as much for, like, if you're just having somebody come in and do your landscaping and you're not trying to do a permaculture thing or something, but any of the social stuff, and I think a lot of the economic stuff, I would definitely recommend working with professionals who know community.
Awesome. Thank you, Yana.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, lots of questions. Let's go to Ken.
Yeah, thank you, Yana, for this information. I am an owner, 50 years, and I am, so I took to heart your warnings about how to own property. I have been trying, we are A1 zoning here in Central Virginia. It's pretty non-restrictive. I am trying to figure out a way to improve my property. I've got 6 acres, 3 parcels adjoining, and can do different things with each one of them. And I've been looking at LLCs as a way to to share and to gain equity. I don't think I'm going to find people that just want to buy me out. My son doesn't want me to do that anyhow. So I'm thinking of retaining something like a 50% ownership for the two of us. And then as we make further improvements, of which there are many possibilities, to use the LLC. Have you heard of any successful or failed even efforts to do that?
I've heard of both successful and failed.
Really?
I mean, I think that, I would definitely look at the SELC website, the Sustainable Economies Law.
Yeah, I just looked at that. That's great.
About the way to structure it, but an LLC can work. The challenge with it, though, is that depending on what state you're in, you sometimes need to refile your paperwork every time a new member comes in. And every time that happens, there's the possibility of having kind of like a breakdown relationally when you're like renegotiating, because that opens up the possibility of like, oh, well, let's renegotiate everything since we have to refile anyway.
Okay, well, I'll work with that to see.
Cautionary note about that.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can create a land trust that gives you and your son rights to the property for the rest of your lives, and then it passes on to the group. So there's some interesting things that have been done in the, there's a National Community Land Trust organization that you can learn more about land trusts in particular with. It's, I mean, I would say that if you are retaining too much of an ownership share compared to everybody else, you're going to have that bad dynamic where you two still ultimately get to call the shots. And obviously you need to like figure out what's going to work for you and your family with inheritance. I mean, it might make sense to sell the other 2 lots into a community entity and let those function as a community, and you being like friends of the community or like participants in the community in some way. I mean, there's creative things that you can do to kind of put that together.
One lot is actually currently in an LLC with my son and myself as rental. That could change. The second lot is ideal for building a house to be shared. I'm 75 now, so it'd be nice to have a house of 10, 12 people. I've been following the Greenhouse Project as a model for some of this. So I'm interested in the co-housing website tomorrow, or workshop tomorrow.
Cool.
And the third property is the original piece with a house and a large shop, and lots of entrepreneurial efforts in that. But I hear what you're saying. I've run into that already. I've been at this for 5 years or so, and people don't trust that you're actually wanting to share.
Right. And it's, and it's understandable because there are many stories about folks who pulled the rug out from under people.
Right.
Yeah. And so, I would say just, make good legal agreements between yourself and the rest of the group if you're going to retain it. So, okay, let's
I think Diana has written some on LLCs, hasn't she?
Yeah, I mean, her book it's a little bit out of date at this point with a bunch of stuff, but the legal section is not too different from what the current scene is. So yeah, so we're creating.
I seem to remember an article in Communities magazine where she went into a little more updated information.
Yeah, there was an updated version that Diana and some other folks did. So yeah, so look for Communities magazine. I mean, if you haven't been
I've got
subscribing, I definitely recommend it.
Right, I'll probably
I'm gonna get somebody else in here, okay?
Yeah.
Ken? Yeah, great.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So Yana, do you want to just keep going down the list?
Sure, yeah.
Go to Frank next.
Okay. I had a question, Yana, about the degree of income sharing versus independence. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about some of the benefits and of each end. For instance, I like the idea of some income sharing or some group work share and say food raising, because it creates interdependence and builds trust. On the other hand, I like the idea of independence in terms of finances because it encourages innovation. You don't just have 3 core businesses that everybody works at. You actually can accommodate the diversity of creativity that's there. Can you say a little bit about kind of being on that spectrum someplace?
Sure. Yeah. So, so one thing to note is that from many communities that have done experiments with partial income sharing, it's really not a thing. I mean, what you're talking about is basically having a bigger fee system or having like a tithing kind of system where it's like everybody puts 10% of their income in or something. The reason why I say that it's not really a thing is that one of the tremendous benefits of income sharing is that it does a lot to flatten power dynamics around class and gender in particular. You know, the communities that I have been a part of that are actually like full income sharing groups have some of the best labor-based gender relationships anywhere, because an hour is an hour, and you know, you're not, it's not about what the outside culture values your time as, it's just your labor counts the same as anybody else's labor. And there's some really remarkable stuff that happens when you do that. There's also, and this is particularly important right now, there's also a degree of economic security that comes from income sharing. Because, you know, in most families, if you have one or two income earners and one of those people loses their jobs, your family is screwed, particularly in a period like right now where it is hard to find other work. And if you have 6 income streams and you lose one of them, it's not nearly the same kind of hit from a security standpoint. So, you know, as far as all of that goes, it's really good. The other thing is that there's a lot of flexibility. Like you know, the group that I live in right now, in the 2 years that we've been on this property, I've lived in 3 different spaces, and I haven't had to like sell my apartment to do that. We just have a conversation and we go, oh, you know what? It actually would be a better configuration if I was living over here instead of here. And it's like, great, let's move. And it's like no big deal. Like there's a real flexibility, and as people's situations change, you can very flexibly, you know, switch up things like how much are we meal sharing, how much are we space sharing, that kind of stuff.
Right.
You know, on the other hand, I do think, you know, the first income sharing community that I lived in just had internal businesses, and I did feel stifled by it. You know, I had things I wanted to pursue, and it
Yeah.
wasn't just weaving hammocks all day.
Yeah.
And so I do think that, you know, I really like communities that both have internal businesses and also allow members to do outside work. And again, it's all still income sharing. And so I think there's a way that you can structure it to the point that you can stifle people. And, you know, I don't think that's great for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I definitely think there's advantages and disadvantages with
Okay,
them.
but there might be a way to combine the two where you could actually allow innovation and creativity, but it still be income sharing, but it's to release creative potential, not make money.
Yeah, like I don't think I have it in here right now, but we, like our group has been looking at, like we're working on right now, like what's another business that we could create collectively. And we've had these very dynamic conversations over the last couple of weeks about what do we want to be doing, and like what does our land suggest to us, and you know, where are our skill sets. And it's been a really dynamic process actually of, you know, looking at business development together.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep, you're welcome. Okay, we probably have time for one more. Sorry, everybody, we're going to run out of time here.
Okay, let's go to Anna. Not sure how to pronounce your name. Go ahead.
Hi, it's Ina. No
Hi.
worries. Yeah, I was just curious, kind of, I think it's coming from this conversation too, is the business plan. Kind of, you talked a little bit about that when you were talking about like looking for properties and stuff, that it's really good to have like a business plan in place. And I think that's a huge thing, especially with the my group of friends who are trying to organize. It's just like not many of us really have the capital or like the resources to rely on, and trying to think of like, okay, so how do you plan that out? Like how long do you have to wait before you can even look into properties? Like, do you have any business plans available for folks to look at, or just like ideas? Like you said, the Sustainable Economies Law Center, that's a great resource. I love them. But like, is there, I don't know, other examples or suggestions that you have to build that kind of thing?
Yeah, I could share. So we have our like spreadsheets that are more like our kind of operating budget, but you can see the different business line items in it. And so I'm happy to share that if that's interesting to folks. And, you know, and ours is relatively simple, which is another reason why like I like income sharing, is like you just simply, you don't have to figure out like, well, how many fees, what fee for this and what fee for that, and how do we charge and how do we figure out that formula? You just don't have to do any of that stuff. So I'm happy to share that stuff. The other thing that I can say, like in terms of like how long do you wait? So one of the things that is a very clever workaround that I've seen a couple groups of people who don't really have a lot of resources to work with is to like rent a house together for a couple years, combine your cars, you know, like really start doing the resource sharing thing pretty intensively, and like live together and sort of like start figuring out how your social dynamics are going to work, and use that as an opportunity to actually save up some money to be able to do a down payment on a place where then you know, you're not going to be paying a landlord anymore. You actually, you know, are able to start building some equity at that point. But I like that workaround a lot, particularly because it does give you a chance to practice the social stuff, which, like I say, that's really the hardest part. So I think something like that. And I, Cynthia, if you'll remind me, I'll find a good shareable version of our sort of monthly spreadsheet thing that can be a part of that.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay.
Well,
We're at time.
I think we're at time. Yeah. Wow. Thank you everyone so much for coming and all of your questions and enthusiasm. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but just more reason for you to come back and to get in touch with Yana and explore all of the resources we have on the ic.org website. I hope that you'll consider putting up a listing or making a classified ad, or, you know, downloading more of our books and materials. There's just a lot there. We really want to support you. This is why one of the reasons we are here as an organization is to support people in starting intentional communities, and really glad that all of you are on that path. And big thanks to you, Yana, for just being here and sharing and doing it so well. And I'll be in touch with all of you via email. I'll send the recording and the slides and that resource Yana just mentioned, and also the chat. So I hope to see some of you tomorrow for the co-housing workshop, yeah? Okay, yes, let's do it. All right, you can open your mics and say your thanks, and we'll close out.
All right.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Nice meeting you. Bye.
Namaste.
Thank you.